Amazing day and a half. We've had Vice-Chancellors and Deputy Vice-Chancellors, and we've had people from outside. Now we've just got ourselves, and the people in the room are going to talk about ICS and the directions of our research, the future of the ways in which we find what the Vice-Chancellor would call challenges. What we might call the end of the world, what we might call the collapse of civilization, the crash of the time we spend on this planet, the disintegration of the processes of being, the unsettling of human life in general. And so we're going to try and talk about what an institute does under such circumstances. I'd first like to acknowledge the custodians of this land, the people of the Darug Nation and peoples of this particular set of lands, and the lands from which we all settle, spend our time, work, study and play. It's a remarkable thing. It's a place of consequence in our lives, and it's become increasingly a place we need to take attention to as the world disintegrates. And what we can do is not become Indigenous or become custodial in their way, but we can learn from that process and think about what it means to live on this planet. What I'd like to do is introduce 4 speakers, but first just try and draw a few common threads out of the previous discussion, if I can, and talk about the whole process by which we as researchers face the present and the future. And what we've done is condensed past, present and future into a couple of really basic questions. And those 2 basic questions are pretty simple ones in a way. Given the most pressing research areas now and in the future will involve responding to the dominance of particular kinds of technological and economic change, what are the basic critical issues that we need to be talking about? And the second one is, what are the key challenges in researching different cultural arenas of social life, local and global? Now, the word challenges there is not meant to put you to sleep, because it's the word everybody uses now. We've now become cognizant of the fact that there is something happening in this world we need to take attention to. We need to be thinking about our research as engaged research in the world. But looking at that and the kinds of things we face, obviously climate change, cultural crises, technological disruption, economic disjunctures, processes of change which are incredible, we find ourselves in a world where our scholars and we, us, all of us, face some really basic issues. And this panel is going to have these ones at the back of its mind as it talks about them. The first one is that really clear one. It's one that was there in all of the talks across the day, bringing together theory and practice. Valentina Bauer described this in some of the manifestations in her work. Hart Cohen talked about the ways in which creative practice takes on methods and theory in realising its own integrity. Lena Nahals discussed how supporting practice is informed by theoretically careful research. I'm just going to go through a couple of these, and they're just meant to sit in the background as prompts or provocations. The second one to this process is generating positive change and standing back to critically describe and dispassionately understand what's actually happening in the world. So it's a contradiction. It's being in the world but not of it. It's being there. It's engagement and positive change, because we're all affecting change. So obviously there's a thing there. And obviously Isaac Lin talked about this on becoming an action researcher, what that engagement means. So the last sessions are building into this one quite nicely. The next one is working simultaneously and variously at various levels of the global and the local. Obviously everything that local is now not global, but everything that's global has local manifestations. And one of the things that we're talking about here is, how do you work simultaneously? When Varnika was talking, she asked the question, who counts as local? The next one is negotiating across different disciplines, and this one's quite complicated. It's not. Svetlana discussed the historically constituted and serendipitously solidified notion of changing disciplinary boundaries, namely that we think of ourselves as interdisciplinary, and yet the very disciplines we generated were all put there in ways by us in the first place. So how do we find that engagement across disciplines while still holding on to the strengths of those disciplines. Then a complicated one in contemporary life, and a lot of people talked about this, is mediating expert knowledge. And most often scientific and technocratic knowledge, mediating that knowledge and the material on the ground experience of people as they live through floods, fires, events, processes, and the banalities of everyday life. How do you put those two things together? Why do certain people become experts at certain times? And what does that mean for how they describe the world to others? And for these four panellists here who have to become experts beyond themselves, they're experts in the things that other people are experts in, as well as trying to think about the phenomenology of people who experience things on the ground. That sort of world is one where Abby was talking about design as having consequence. Then 6, translating between different kinds of knowledge, and there are lots of kinds of knowledge that were talked about through the various groups, and we can talk about theoretical practical knowledge, local and global knowledge, customary, traditional and postmodern, modern knowledges, hermeneutic and scientific knowledges. That's what these people do. They're negotiating between those forms of knowledge as they work. And the last one, which I almost didn't put on them, but is being a person. That is the idea that we're not just researchers. There were a number of people who, and it's come to us very forcefully through the question of COVID, that we actually live in this world, we don't just research it, and in living in this world we're informed by the very world we're trying to research, and we've got to hold on to who we are as people at the same time. A number of people raised it implicitly, and we're not going to put that on the panel to talk about it, but it's that kind of thing which we have to face if we're going to manage our future in the Institute. So we've got 4 speakers, and the first is Josh Wodak. I'll introduce him, and I'll introduce each of the speakers in turn as they come up. Josh is one of the most inquiring minds in the Institute. He works at the intersection of environmental humanities and science and technology studies. His research addresses the socio-cultural dimensions, the climate crisis and the Anthropocene, with a focus on the ethics and efficacy of conservation through technoscience. Almost a contradiction, but I'll leave that to Josh to try and work out. Thanks, Josh.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for the invitation to present on this panel. It's really a delight to be here and to see everyone in the real world again. All right, turtles all the way down. I missed the joke. Oh, okay, cool. All right. So, in this presentation, I'll try to sketch some of the critical challenges facing cultural research about the ecological and climate crisis. Part 1 speaks to the planet we inhabit, that is, the set and setting for all our endeavours. Part 2 speaks to the unsettling of this planet and life upon it, and of technoscientific proposals to forestall the eminence of this world. The challenge I'd like to convey arises from where the humanities and social sciences fold their human-centred foci into the inhuman and more than human cosmos to which all life is behest. That is, cultural research on the radical asymmetry and radical contingency between life and this particular planet. In Vedic cosmology, the world turtle expresses how only partial knowledge may ever be acquired from infinite regression in fields as diverse as metaphysics and epistemology. As Johann Fichte surmised, we build our houses on the earth rests on an elephant, the elephant on a tortoise, the tortoise again, who knows on what, and so on ad infinitum. Contrary to the veneer of stability proffered by the concrete and steel beneath our feet, this stage is more intrinsically volatile and precarious than discourse on the topic would like to concede. The formation of the Isthmus of Panama makes for a telling illustration of the asymmetry and contingency on which our houses are perched. Before this isthmus, North and South America were not connected, such that oceans on either side of the Americas mixed. Over some 5 million years, volcanic eruptions, born of tectonic rifts between both continents, created the isthmus that connected North to South America, but in so doing separated Pacific from Atlantic oceans. When the land bridge fully closed the seaway 3 million years ago, it profoundly changed global ocean circulation. The difference of salinity between the newly separated oceans, as well as their new convection pathways, moved heat around the planet with telling repercussions. Namely, the isthmus formation effectively catalysed the origins of the Quaternary period, beginning with northern hemisphere glaciation, arguably precipitated by oceanic heat transfer from the Arctic to the Arctic, now that the isthmus had closed the seaway. Such are the proverbial origins of the geological period Earth still resides within, distinctly marked, as it were, by the Quaternary's incessant shifts between glacial and interglacial periods. As always, such simple sketches belie the extent to which this planet is capable and prone toward reconfiguration that borders on the wholesale. For instance, in 1914, the same year the Panama Canal was completed, Serbian geophysicist and astronomer Milutin Milankovic published his landmark study about the issue of the astronomical theory of ice ages, postulating that there is a correlation between the eccentricity, obliquity and precession of Earth's orbit and incessant oscillations between glacial and interglacial periods. These correlations, termed Milankovic cycles, have been linked to climatic changes over the past 200 million years, but the cycles appear to exert more pronounced climatic changes in the Quaternary period. The Isthmus of Panama, Northern Hemisphere glaciation, and the Milankovic cycles appear to relate to one another, albeit these are relations composed of radical asymmetry and contingency. Such are the forces, scales, modes, and tempos at play in the unsettling currently unfolding. Similarly, no longer are these tall tales mere backdrop to concerns beyond the acumen of the humanities and social sciences. As Dipesh Chakrabarty reasons, quote, "For humanists living in such times and contemplating the Anthropocene, questions about histories of volcanoes, mountains, oceans, and plate tectonics, the history of the planet in short, have become as routine in the life of critical thought as questions about global capital and the necessary inequities of the world that it made." Or, as geophysicist David Archer puts it in the long thaw, how humans are changing the next 100,000 years of Earth's climate, quote, "Human climate forcing has the potential to overwhelm the orbital climate forcing, taking control of the ice ages. Mankind is becoming a force in climate comparable to the orbital variations that drive the glacial cycles. That is, the cumulative consequences of global industrial activity have already overwhelmed some forcings of the Milankovic cycles." Both Chakrabarty and Archer allude to how Earth is technically in a no-analog state, which is begetting a no-analog future. And, like the seemingly diminutive landmass that is the Isthmus of Panama, the latency of these consequences belie their planetary scale and geological time. Or, to ground this in liquid, the vast majority of heat from greenhouse gas combustion currently resides in the ocean. If this heat is rapidly released back into the atmosphere, those consequences will reconfigure the planet once more. Part 2. Our set and setting comes to terms with the unsettling. The world turtle, with all its insatiable desires for certainty and predictability, is now tinged with a predicament encapsulated by a scene from Blade Runner. You're in a desert, walking along with the sand, when all of a sudden you look down and you see a tortoise. It's crawling toward you. You reach down, you flip the tortoise over on its back. The tortoise lays on its back, its belly baking in the hot sun, beating its legs, trying to turn itself over, but it can't, not without your help. But you're not helping. Why is that? This predicament is an apt analogy for anyone concerned with a vast cultural, economic and social array that is put in place against a clear and honest understanding of our situation, let alone any responses to it. This panel has been asked to expound on what it is that we bring to our cultural research processes. What do we draw from our research? And how do we negotiate tensions, as Paul mentioned, such as those between theory, practice, local, global, and being engaged, standing back? Before turning these questions to more concrete matters than poetic metaphors and symbolic film vignettes, I'll mention an example from my research that takes us up in the real-world situation of turtle conservation, and in particular of the largest green sea turtle rookery in the world, in the Great Barrier Reef, in drawing a line in the sand, bioengineering its conservation in the face of extinction debt, published last month. While this article is on negotiating the complexities of the technological world as it pertains to conservation, when the only potentially efficacious action has been reduced to radical and risky technoscience, I want to close by considering how cultural researchers may bring such analytical lens toward climate action when said action has also been reduced to bioengineering and geoengineering. 1 month before the 21st COP conference, climatologist Kevin Anderson published his analysis of all 400 scenarios the IPCC was using to model global warming over the remainder of the century. Writing in the journal Nature Geoscience, he was scathing, not of how the scenarios acknowledged that runaway climate change would be precipitated, but rather their unquestioned assumption that a techno-fix, and only a techno-fix, could possibly avert runaway climate change. Or, in academic parlance, scathing is expressed by Anderson writing, quote, in plain language, that the scenarios work on the basis of either an ability to change the past or the successful and large-scale uptake of negative emissions technologies, which includes synthetic biology and climate engineering and things like that. In less plain language, he accounts that 344 of the 400 scenarios, quote, assume the successful and large-scale uptake of nets, whereas, quote, global emissions peak around 2010 in the remaining 56 scenarios, despite annual emissions continually rising year in and year out. Having attended COP21 in Paris, Anderson penned an article for Nature, published only 9 days after the Paris Agreement was forged, where he had been scathing in October of that year, 2015. By December, he was outraged, decrying the agreement as a delusion that, quote, rests on the assumption that the world will successfully suck the carbon pollution it produces back from the atmosphere in the longer term via nets. While such, quote, exotic Dr. Strangelove options were discussed only as last-ditch contingencies until a few years ago, now he decries they are Plan A. 3 years later, the IPCC belatedly came around to acknowledging such, except for the irony that the farce is akin to the hubris that Kubrick satirised so. That is, in their global warming of 1.5 degree special report of 2018, they remarked that, quote, with the national pledges as they stand, warming would exceed 1.5, at least for a period of time, and practices and technologies that remove CO2 from the atmosphere at a global scale will be required to return warming to 1.5. That graph on your right is what they're trying to get across. 2 months ago, 17 former heads of government, national ministers, directors of intergovernmental organisations, leaders of environmental groups and academic experts formed the Climate Overshoot Commission. It recognised that, quote, absent removing excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and possibly cooling the planet by reflecting incoming sunlight, that the already inevitable overshoot will catalyse runaway climate change. Their first meeting takes place this month. Such is the rise of desperation and last-ditch gambling on a techno-fix that faces cultural researchers in this domain. How then does Raymond Williams adage that, quote, we have mixed our labour with the earth, our forces with its forces too deeply to be able to draw back and separate either out, help cultural researchers navigate between hubris and humility when it comes to the looming inevitability of overshooting the proverbial 1.5 degree guardrail. The former implies the gusto of the Climate Overshoot Commission. The latter instead acquiesces to how all intentional interventions amount to a mere canal through the Isthmus of Panama, if, that is, they are considered in their cosmic rather than human-centred context. Imagine if the so-called solution to global heating was to make the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans once again one, by obliterating the isthmus that divides them, in order to dissipate the colossal repository of heat biding its time in the ocean. What then of the continental plates measured between North and South America, which fuel the volcanic archipelago beneath this isthmus? If we mix our labour with that earth, how far will it take us downward and into the inner workings of the unsettling beneath our feet? After all, its total is all the way down.
So Josh wins the record for being to the second. That was so precise I could not believe it. It was actually exactly. So now Stephen has something to live up to, of course. Stephen is an amazing and deeply committed researcher who is part of a collaborative research project that's challenged the dominance of a particular kind of economics that has taken over our world for more than a century. His research concentrates on the relationship between economy, subjectivity, and the enactment of alternative socialities. Stephen, thanks.
Thanks, Paul. And thanks as well to the organizers of this 10th anniversary event and for the opportunity to speak. So I understood the topic to be about research futures, and at least in part about the role that cultural research can play in shaping the futures that we might want. I've had the opportunity at ICS to do engaged research with colleagues both here and abroad, and to see it done well by others, in fact by everyone who's spoken here today. Like everyone else, I'm feeling like life and work has been profoundly unsettled over the last couple of years, but I also feel like I've been thinking about this with you all for the whole time that I've been here, 8 years this week. So when I arrived at ICS, Timothy Morton's book, Hyperobjects, had just come out, and he was describing the impacts of climate change as the end of the Earth, something that Josh just reiterated. The end of the Earth is a predictable, stable backdrop for an unfolding human history. 8 years later, with students at ICS, I've been reading Machado de Oliveira's book, Hospicing Modernity, where she describes the end of the globe, the end of the dominant story some of us have told ourselves about the economy of progress and development. So the present moment has shifted Morton and de Machado Oliveira's reflections from the genre of near-term speculative fiction into current events. In the mid-pandemic Australian context, supply chain disruption, inflationary pressure, surging power costs, geopolitical instability, all flavors of extreme weather events add to this sense of uncertainty. So yesterday, a speaker from Deloitte described the process of staged retreat in areas of Western Sydney in the face of climate change as the difficult conversation that we need to have. The air got heavier when she said that, I thought, and she pointed to Lismore as a place where this conversation is already happening. So what does this mean then for the future of research and for researching futures? One of the things that defines the research culture at ICS is the concept of engaged research, and certainly that means investing attention in things that are vital and urgent. But it's also an opportunity for a different approach to research practice, a process of inviting people, collaborators, and partners into a process of inquiry, discovery, sense, and meaning-making. And many of the talks today have illustrated that. In my own field of inquiry of economic geography, the aim has been to reframe economy as a space of diverse cultural practice, and therefore ethical and political possibility. So seeing these possibilities involves holding aside presupposition in favor of investigation. For abolitionist geographer Ruth Gilmore, it's an invitation to extend the powers of negation, to quote, analyze relationship dynamics that extend beyond obvious conceptual or spatial boundaries, and then to decide what a particular form, old or new, is made of by trying to make it into something else. What this means is that negation is a process of astute observation that attunes us to other possibilities inherent in what already exists. So for example, with colleagues back in the States, we've been mapping in New York and Philadelphia and Worcester the density of worker cooperatives, credit unions, housing cooperatives, community gardens, and other spaces that comprise an economy of solidarity, and found that their highest density is in precisely those neighborhoods that had been subject to redlining more than half a century ago. In this case, negation is according a new possibility to what's already present, though dimly perceived. If we take negation, what is and what might be, as a proxy for the latent and manifest content of dreaming, then this project is about dreaming of a future solidarity city that operates beyond the confines of white supremacy and racial capitalism, by locating those spaces and relationships as already partly outside of that norm and order. And thanks, Namra, for turning me on to that quote. More recent work involves colleagues and collaborators in the field in a redrawing of the circular economy. Redrawing, extending the power of the negative to imagine and enact other possible futures is key here. In speaking with an unnamed member of a legal team of a large multinational waste firm about circularity, his response was to say to me, yeah, we're way behind Europe when it comes to the circular economy. We've not invested nearly enough in high-temperature waste incineration facilities. So that's one version of what circularity is, not one that I'm particularly invested in. So I've been working most closely with colleague Abby Melick Lopez to look at other possibilities for organic waste, circular or otherwise. And in the context of Sydney, it's particularly important to imagine other valuations and possibilities for waste. And one initiative we've come across is spearheaded by the Good Garlic Company, headed by Michelle Zybots, who's kindly consented to allow me to mention her by name. So Michelle is enacting a different form of circularity, collecting dehydrated food waste from institutions in Sydney, universities, coffee shops, trucking them up to Hartley Vale, just outside of Lithgow, to improve soil fertility in her farm where she grows organic garlic, which is then sold back into Sydney. This other circular economy involves baristas banging out a half-ton of coffee grounds a week in the Campo shop in Newtown alone, one of 700, this becomes part of the 200 tons of organic waste that she's legally allowed to accept on her farm on an annual basis. The coffee grounds repel vermin, but as they mellow, they attract worms, more than you can imagine, which then changes the soil's tilth, and in accord with regenerative farming practices, this improves the capacity of the soil to hold water, store carbon, and grow garlic. As Michelle said, this is an approach to peri-urban agriculture that could work as well for industrial hemp as it could for garlic, and that's phase 2 of this project. She's already convinced several other farmers around her by power of her example to follow suit. So organic waste composes 45% of all that ends up in Sydney's tip. A preferred circular future would be to divert this waste into regenerative farming that is a site better than the proposed waste incinerator that was initially going to be located in Blacktown. Now they're pushing it onto Lithgow, and I would assert to you that garlic is better than ash, and that this is another way of thinking in solidaristic terms. A second example from this project is centered in the regional town of Cowra, a regional center west of the mountains and east of the tablelands. So Cowra is in a basin which makes it a poor candidate for wind farming. But like the Good Garlic Company, Cowra has a champion in Dylan Gower, who's been working tirelessly to tie alternative energy and the distributed network to the town's regional future. So Clean Cowra registered as a nonprofit in 2012, and for the past decade has been building support, developing a municipal biodigester that would transform agricultural and food industrial and domestic organic waste into a source of electrical power, heat, and fertilizer for the benefit of the local community. Organically, this other future has unfolded in relation to 2 nodes. So with a decade of effort and critical support from the Office of Heritage and Environment and the CECF financing scheme, the first of these biodigesters in the southwest node is now operational, and it's attached to an abattoir. And it will likely play a key role in the ongoing commercial viability of this business, which is the town's largest employer. The second node is located adjacent to a business park that can supply both organic waste streams to the digester and in turn consume the heat and power that it produces. The expectation is that the scaled version of this plant will be operational within a year. So we're encountering this project at just the right time in the context of this research. Power, energy security, soil tilth and fertility, a new relationship between town and country, industry and agriculture. Negation is seeing other possibilities in what presently exists. Both these initiatives are at a critical point in their story, and for Abby and I, this directs what I think an engaged research process entails. As Michelle Zybots puts it, the technical dimensions of the circular economy are in fact quite simple. What's difficult is maintaining the social relationships that make it possible. Both she and Dylan have flagged the crucial cultural dimension of the circular economy, the need to link changes in material practice to the stories we tell, the meanings we ascribe, the possibilities we accord in practice. What did I do for time? 1 minute remaining. Oh good, I've got 1 minute. I just want to say it was such a delight to hear the talks yesterday, and in particular to have a welcome to country from Uncle Greg. So he did the welcome to country for each of the 3 Rethinking Post-Capitalist Politics classes that we ran with 40 international students. And he sat down with them for half an hour and talked to each one of them. And whatever country they were from, he knew someone who was from there. And he did it with such humor, and he was so warm. And I realized what I was watching was somebody who was expert in making kinship. That's what he was doing. And I have to say, once he did that, it felt like the rest of the class pretty much taught itself. He created a truly convivial environment. He made people feel welcome to country. I felt welcome to country. This is, my 8th year here. That's the end of my lecture.
It's been fantastic having you with us, Stephen. It's been great. I coincided with Stephen's arrival just a bit, maybe 2 years before, and it's been a remarkable time. The next speaker is Louise Crabtree-Hayes, whose important research, I think, exemplifies that sort of dynamism and engagement of what good engaged research, rigorous engaged research needs to do. Her work focuses on the positive possibilities of community-driven development, on housing innovation as practice and policy, on complex adaptive systems theory in urban contexts. So I'm going to come back to this question, but extending the power of the negative seemed to be something of a theme that might be running through Louise's work. Thanks, Louise. If you just go straight forward, and go on to yours. Look at that.
Magic. Thanks, Paul. And I'm going to be needing your help because I thought I had a script and now I'm not so sure. So I'm going to be wandering on and off script, I think. So I just want to echo all of those extraordinary acknowledgements of country that we've had over the past day and a half, and really like what you just said about Uncle Greg, Stephen, and the way that he does do that really deep work of building him and bringing everyone to a space. Which, I guess what I'm really going to talk about is how we actually do research in and for transition. And what it means to actually be trying to change the world or working in the world while it's changing and in ways that we don't actually, we can't predict, because prediction is probably becoming an obsolete art if it ever had any validity. So the issue for us though is that while we're researching in this space, we actually have to we have to identify and enable appropriate ways of being and doing, but also enact them against a changing backdrop and in a changing context. And so, thinking about the work that we've been doing at Lithgow, for example, which has been now 3 years, I think, and we're about to embark on a 2-year major stream of work across citizen science, creative industries, and building the capacity of the development and planning industry. What we started out there with was a sort of collective visioning exercise that created 4 streams around education, health, the local economy and what a transitioning economy looks like, but also foundationally how to change the story of place and how to actually start to enable that story changing and what that meant to then work as the story was changing and while making it change. And so that work has been a sort of process of setting parameters and setting principles and then running to catch up with them as they start to actually act in the world, such that we now have a research scaffold that sits above a whole suite of embedded research sub-projects or sub-activities that have come from that context. So it's now we've got this sort of sporing of things, which is wonderful. So, the situation that we're in, where we're trying to work in a changing world, we don't want to discard the sort of methods that we've used, but a lot of them aren't actually fit for process and fit for purpose. So we're sort of straddling a world, I think, or what we find ourselves frequently doing is settling into a space between intention and outcome, where we set the objectives or set the parameters by which we want to act, but have to remain open to the fact that they may not actually go as we intended and what we then do in that context. And here's my pretty picture if you look at while I'm talking about that. So, first page can go. So the ability to adapt on the way, as we know, is an inherent requirement of working in complex systems that are changing as and because we work in them. So the second part of that, because we work in them bit, is what we need to be especially attentive to, because this is deeply cultural work. When we're talking about changing the parameters of the possible and what we think is possible, we clearly need storytelling in there, and we clearly need approaches that are sensitive to place and that can't be cookie cutter, but that can balance between what we know from best practice, quote unquote, so many problematic terms, but doing that in place and in ways that make sense, and then speaking back to what we can take forward from there. So, in doing this work, what we've realised is that there's a range of attendant issues that also need addressing, or the structures that need to change, and that trigger changes in the nature and the parameters of our work. So these actually include things like the really boring things like funding mechanisms, recognition and reward structures within universities, and reconfigurations of how universities engage and partner with the world in which they're embedded. As we know, ICS has been grappling with this for quite a while in setting up our engaged research sort of framework and platform and how we do it. So the work can be slow and messy. The structures and processes that we use are not always fit for purpose, and so this touches on the broader role of ourselves as researchers and ICS as an entity in advocating for and driving the changes that we need to see in the parameters and structures of research and of the sector at large. But then bringing it right back down to ourselves, and as Paul flagged, in the time of COVID and against this backdrop of a growing concern for care for ourselves and the non-human, this work and how we enable and configure thriving worlds includes how we care for ourselves, our teams, our partners, our communities, as we live and work and as everything's also changing. So there's a growing question of how we work amidst phenomena such as the Great Resignation, but that's also amidst the longer-standing, ongoing, systemic and viable impacts of overwork and over-extraction on ourselves, our loved ones, our colleagues, our partners, the environment, and so on. But it also highlights the need to recognise that the current changes and the exhaustion caused by extractive practices are differentially experienced. So the long-standing impacts, as we know, of extraction have historically been easier to circumvent or ignore as they were offloaded onto peripheral places and bodies, but they're harder to ignore now as they move closer towards their points of origin in the power centres of the extractive capital. Now the problem is that that's where the university sits. So how do we work in this landscape, and how do we fashion usable tools from what we have to hand? So it's cultural work, as I've said, it's oriented towards systemic change, so we have to engage in value regimes, patterns of behaviour, and other daily practices of world making. So decisions about how to enable thriving worlds immediately trigger questions of how to identify and prioritise preferred courses of action based on access to and comprehension of relevant matters of concern. But, as I said, our systems are constantly changing, and this knowledge can never be complete. And so rather than seeking to always expand our knowledge base, increasingly we are called to relax into the not knowing and into incomplete understanding, messy dialogue, and the possibility of failure, understanding that establishing the fulfilment of knowledge as even possible and a desired endpoint was actually part of the crisis. However, those sorts of orientations are not easy bedfellows to outcomes-oriented research processes and the frameworks that we operate in that are so oriented towards KPIs. And I also don't want to give the impression that action is futile or that knowledge is irrelevant, but to understand that there is no ideal and perfectible end state to which our actions can be oriented. So it means that identifying and experimenting with relationships, ethics, methods, work process and outcomes that resonate with the ideal of thriving as a way to enact it through our work, while being at ease with the possibility of failure of all of the above. So the work's direct and conscious engagement with world making, the iterative nature of the work and its required openness to the unexpected all highlight the centrality of storytelling and other modes of cultural and communicative practice to both envisage and create desired worlds and ways of being. So here's my single quote. And this is a really nice essay that I just found called Instructions for the Age of Emergency. And it says, I think those who don't expect a return to normalcy will be the best positioned to harness the moment for good, to create and choose new stories that will guide us into the future. Stories where technology serves humankind and not profit. Or we can probably throw out the tech, but let's get into that later. Stories unlike the ones we have had in The Road or Ex Machina, where we aren't terrified of each other, aren't suspicious of each other, don't enslave each other for profit and pleasure. Stories that reflect the lived reality of disaster research, that humankind is fundamentally kind. We live in a dystopia now, but the age of emergency is our best chance to change it. And I think what's nice about that is it speaks to what we do in a lot of this work, which is actually just creating a social space, and that, and why I highlighted what Stephen said about Uncle Greg, creating a convivial and cooperative space and a collaborative and open space so that when change happens, it's not that we've predicted the way in which it's going to happen and know how we'll respond, but we've created an atmosphere and a space in which people know they will turn to each other when it happens. So it's about changing, I guess, the patterns of relationships rather than thinking that we know what we're going to do exactly because we've got it all mapped out because we're so clever. So this also calls for working across multiple modalities, disciplines and discourses, as we've heard over the past day and a half, creating the teams and approaches that are appropriate to the task at hand. That also enables us to identify points of leverage and opportunistic cracks into which the work may work, while also understanding that while our efforts in one realm may be futile, they may actually enable action or take hold in another. So there's a temporality to this as well, where the impact may not be where or when you expect it to be, but it may actually, trigger something later. So the temporal element in which impact or success, if we have to use those registers, may not be discernible for years or in the places or forms that we expect. The sensitivity to that slowness is something I'm acutely aware is not universally possible, especially in an increasingly precarious researcher population. So hence the need for the work to simultaneously seek to enable, if not demand, care within our workplaces and broader societal structures, such that the timelines and practices of research can be channeled through a greater diversity of options and spaces. I'm going to wind up there. There's a lot more I could say in this space, and just trying to write this triggered more questions in myself that I have time to answer or engage with here, and I'm already feeling myself disagreeing with myself as I wrote this a couple of days ago, so I'm going to wind up, but very much thank Paul for the invitation and the organisers for the opportunity to contribute, and I really want to get into discussion with the rest of the panel, so thank you.
Where would we be if we didn't disagree with ourselves? The big trouble. And now I'd like to introduce Brett Nelson. He's an up-and-coming researcher. He's an extraordinarily innovative researcher who's been making a major difference to rethinking a whole lot of themes in the world. It's a great pleasure to think about the ways in which he's made a difference in the area of borders, logistics, data centres and capitalist operations. His writing aims to provide alternative ways of conceiving globalisation, with a particular emphasis on cultural dimensions. And you find in all of the talks that have been given, the question of the cultural keeps coming through. And for all of the solutionism of the scientists or the economists, or the people who are working now with a new sense of worth, those people who work with statistics, particularly the epidemiologists, that people who interpret are still important. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Paul. I'm going to talk primarily about international engagement. So I think that makes it really important to acknowledge where I stand on grammatical land. We're talking about the future of cultural research, and the three presentations that have preceded me have focused heavily on the climate. I want to propose that in the slice of time where we sit now, we cannot speak of climate without speaking about war. And that's not only because the war in Ukraine has brought a fossil fuel bonanza. It's because the planetary dimensions of climate change do cross the global dynamics of politics. And it's because both of these phenomena, climate and war, trouble the schema of internationality that arose in the 19th century. Both concentrate logics of conflict, change and technology into precise spaces, bringing them into single points which have immediate contact with wholes. So, I don't think the relation between climate and war can be brought to any kind of happy end. Paul asked us to think about positive change. Stephen says we arrive at the positive by extending the negative. But I'd like to say that this extension of the negative has to be negativity that doesn't fold into a dialectic or some kind of happy end like Francis Fukuyama, thought we could have wrongly with history in a similarly deep moment of transition, 1989. In the last years, we've seen flood, fire, war, and plague. It's a logic of disruption that we've come to know well through supply chain blockages. These blockages, as Stephen briefly mentioned, are really important to the inflationary pressures we face in our economies now, these so-called cost of living issues, as companies build in the expectation of further disruption to their pricing mechanisms. But these blockages, which have been particularly acute in the pandemic, have brought us some rethinking in terms of our thought. If you look at the literature on supply chain management, for instance, you have strong propositions that we have to move from just-in-time production to just-in-case production, and you have an emphasis on a shift from paradigms of resilience to paradigms of viability. It's an iteration, an emphasis not merely on adaptability, but long-term sustainability. So this is one thing that the pandemic has brought us, ways to think beyond this paradigm of resilience, which we've heard about for a long time. We can talk a lot about how supply chains cross the issue of culture. It's a debated issue across the human sciences. But I think it's particularly apposite at this moment to look at the debate on critical supply chains. If you look at Biden's executive order 14017, issued on the 24th of February 2001, it identifies 4 critical supply chains that the United States has to prioritize. These supply chains are for semiconductors, pharmaceutical ingredients, critical minerals, and large-scale batteries. Now, Australia has a particular place in the supply chain for these last 2 critical items. Large capacity batteries and critical minerals, mainly rare earth elements. The focus on the mining of these kinds of materials is central to economic projections in this country. It's central to ideologies of green transition around the world. But if you look at this document, this executive order, it's quite interesting the way in which it folds these issues of energy transition, primarily seen in a techno-fix frame, to refer back to Josh's concerns, and I echo those concerns as I mention this. The way it folds these logics around geopolitical logics, sustainability logics around geopolitical logics, because these critical supply chain issues are not only about environment and sustainability, they're also about cutting China out of these very supply chains and threatening China's position in activities like rare earth extraction, innovation in environmental technologies, particularly solar and wind. All paths to these alternative energy sources these days pass through China. And Australia's position as a country that can offer these kinds of minerals is crucial to this imagined change. The geopolitical and the sustainable are wrapping around each other in dangerous ways that we need to be aware of and which we need to address in this country. So the series of seminars that are being planned between the Automated Worlds program in this institute and the Environment and Technology program around future extractivism try to speak to these very problems. Keeping in mind that when we talk about extraction, we also have to look at the debates around data extraction, data production, which are heavily explored through that research program and through the Centre of Excellence in Automated Decision Making. But we also need to think this through the geopolitical dimensions here, particularly Australia's relation with its primary trading partner, which is China. We need to think about China's position in terms of environmental technologies, their ability to activate them at scale, and the problems with cutting China out of chains which are based around energy transition. You know, the idea of engagement that's central to our vision of ourselves in cultural research is also one that's thrown around in terms of international diplomacy. And in West-China relations, we have this new paradigm called strategic competition, which explicitly sees itself in contrast to a logic of engagement. So we operate under these conditions. Even Kevin Rudd's 2020 book about China, The Avoidable War, its subtitle is The Case for Managed Strategic Competition. So how do we begin to think of these dynamics in ways that get us beyond thinking about geopolitics in primarily international relation terms? These are issues that I've certainly worked on through projects like Data Farms, which I worked on with Tanya, Svetlina, Ned, and others, where we think about conditions of power mediated through technologies that create different kinds of spaces than those given by the schema of internationality. But it's a difficult task when we begin to think about this perspective of collaboration, because more and more our perspectives on international research collaboration are looked through national security optics. We have the foreign interference legislation, which is not something that's going to go away quickly, because it's on one of those list of demands that Australia has asked, China has asked Australia to remove, and we have a media circling the new government saying, make no concessions. We have this dominant way of looking at the world now, which is, you know, democracy versus autocracy. You know, it's not quite a cultural essentialism, but, you know, it's just as bad, maybe worse. We need to ask ourselves, we have this idea that democracy is great for research innovation, but is it? You know, what I would say is good for research innovation is funding, and plenty of it. And a democracy that underfunds its research is likely to do worse on the innovation front than an autocracy that's prepared to give funding. So these are issues in which we chart our future. Sustainability, geopolitics, and these changing relations. We need to keep an eye on the local. We need to start with the students we have from China, the colleagues we have from China. We need to keep making our academic and research relations. David has just received a distinguished appointment at Beijing Foreign Studies University, I believe. So these are all things that we need to look at and think about as we move into the future. Thanks.
Wow. All right, with all these questions, and then we would have had some time, but I'm going to ask a few questions of our panellists, and then hopefully if we have time, because I've got too many questions, I might actually ask if you have any. I'm against participationism. I'm against democracy. I think I changed my views on that. Very similar to Brett. When I saw the House President, the chair of the American House, quoting the poetry of Bono on the Ukrainian war, and I knew that was the end of tolerance. So I'm going to start by asking a couple of questions of different people. Very hard to know where to start, but let me ask Josh, because it comes out of a discussion we had drinking alcohol in Church Street, and it's that question of what happens to notions of agency once we've fallen through your looking glass, the one which holds together the Anthropocene, the geophysical nature of the work, and the ways in which earth sciences and deep geological time come together. What you're really doing is stepping back into a place which is even more big and generative than what Brett was talking about. What happens to agency under those circumstances?
You mean like
Now let me bring you a microphone.
you mean human agency?
And hold it up.
Human agency you're referring to, yeah?
What's that?
Human agency. Yeah.
That's what we're talking about.
I mean, I guess a good concrete way to put it is that, I mean, I think in the slide that I showed about the IPCC report with the very euphemistic, climate overshoot is inevitable and then it's going to come down through mega emission technologies. The foremost amongst these is to spray sulfur particles in the atmosphere and mimicry of what volcanoes do, because that's what most volcanic eruptions do. So essentially, you talk about agency, trying to basically behave like volcanoes. So co-opt what volcanoes have done for billions of years, but because they reflect incoming solar radiation back into space and temporarily does actually lower the temperature. So this, if we want to go down this, not we in this room, but if the Climate Overshoot Commission and the IPCC, etc., are now proceeding down these avenues, yeah, my provocation to that is, if we want to play on that stage without agency, you better know your volcanoes.
I want to follow that question up really by asking the others, that is, if we're caught in this dialectic of agency, and it is dialectical in the ways that, and I'll come back to your dialectics in a second, Brett, because I think we have gone beyond the dialectics of hope and despair that the 20th century was built around, the sort of Frankfurt School post-totalitarian notion of getting away from hope and despair and attempting to find a politics which came out of that and a cultural practice which was livable. I wanted to ask others about agency in the areas that you're working in. So let me start with, say, Stephen and Louise first. In the areas you're working, given that the very people you're working with are constituted by the forces that those two guys have been talking about, and therefore their hopes and aspirations are actually bound up with the continuity of those older forms, how do you work? How do you bring that to a reflexive level? How do you manage your own sense of well-being under those circumstances? I see Louise is passing on the
And I'm going to answer your question by answering the question I want to ask, which was implicit in Brett's talk, which is about the negation of the negation, right?
Yeah.
The idea that somehow what I'm describing here with Michelle's work at Good Garlic Company or the Clean Power Initiative is some kind of utopia or progress. I think after reading Marshall de Oliveri's book, I see it as more of an improvisational hospicing, right? That this is making use of materials at hand in order to cope with a world that's already out of control. So like that question of how do you build soil structure that can retain water, it's suddenly a very salient one, not just with respect to the future of farming in this area, but to the viability of urban infrastructure. Right? So there's a way in which that coping strategy becomes vitally important for us, not for a shiny new future, but to survive in the present world that we already have. And it's the same thing with the viability of agriculture in regional communities where, Dylan was very pragmatic about this. He said, look, you can't do intensive grain farming without fertilizer. And fertilizer is basically condensed natural gas. So if we develop a kind of infrastructure around these pyrolysis or digestive technologies, we create an alternative fertilizer source, we create the conditions for autonomous agriculture, practiced at scale, and complementing other kinds of farming. I'm looking at some of my farm-friendly colleagues. So, again, it's sort of a coping strategy reflecting the reality that I think for the long term now, we're going to be playing for keeps when it comes to access to things like natural gas. Like, that's the new geopolitical reality, which I think, I'm not exaggerating, right?
No.
No. So, yeah, this is definitely, it's improv time.
Louise.
Yeah, I think what you're talking, I think our language of coping mechanisms and coping strategies is really key, and also, in the context of Lithgow, because it's a town that's been repeatedly affected by very large-scale forces and processes and industries and decisions made, sort of often elsewhere. That coping mechanism sort of approach is a really key part of responding to that history and that landscape, and it's part of why there's such a strong focus on changing the story, because there's been so many repeated imposed narratives and imposed terrains of possibility. And so opening up spaces to just talk about other things that might be possible and showing people other things that might be possible. And so there's a lot of focus on simply taking things out, I wouldn't say out, but taking things to Lithgow and finding things that people are interested in that they haven't previously seen or wouldn't ever think would happen there because of how they've been scripted as a place and how people receive them as a place. And just seeing what happens when that space is opened up, because there's this extraordinary capacity that has been partly engaged with and fostered, but quite often just largely sidelined by these kind of large-scale actions and forces. And so I guess it's sort of touching on the agency thing, we're bringing that sense of agency back to things that people can immediately do and the aspirations that they've had. And one of the partners there talked about local primary school where it was dress as your future self. And the majority of the kids, primary kids, turned up in high-vis and mining hats, even as the mines are closing, because their sense of their possibility has historically been constructed as we're going to work in these industries, and those industries are changing. And I think there was one kid who went as a script writer and one who went as a fashion designer. But it's so just tapping these really basic senses of, well, how do we start to talk with kids about, well, what might you want to be for the future? And it doesn't change the fact that, there's this broader landscape within which they're operating, but I think as you're saying, Stephen, that how do you cope in that? And how do you find the ways of, sort of engaging with that? Because at the same time, one of the biggest industries in town is an armaments manufacturer that's increasingly sort of working on high-tech weapons of war. That in some ways, there are, it opens up possibilities in terms of people thinking, well, I could be a coder or I could be a designer, but do I want to be doing it on weapons of war, or do I want to somehow take that somewhere else? There's a lot of trying to find ways to circumvent things, I guess, in this as well, but operating in a changing landscape, so there's no guarantee any of it's going to work. So it's how to foster that sense of coping and that sense of storytelling and trying to create a world that isn't necessarily parameters. And just sticking with it.
Thank you. In your talk, Louise, you talked about changing parameters. Now I'm going to turn that back upon the guys that work with the parameters. Is it possible at the level at which you work to change the parameters? Are you talking with people on the ground in such ways that your research takes you into the field, talking about the things, the frameworks, the understandings they take for granted? Well, we know that the people who work in logistics, and I never knew logistics could be so exciting. Who thought that supply chain analysis could actually turn into one of the great world's analysis of the kinds of problems that exist in the world today? But they do. And when you talk to such people, they're not unlike us. They're passionate about the work in which they do. Can you change the parameters at the level at which you work?
When you talk to these people, you find out that they're pretty good at changing parameters. That's what they do. To take the example of people I've talked to, supply chain managers, logisticians, I mean, their work is suffused with a fantasy of smoothness and seamlessness, clearly. But these people know very well that they face blockages and disruptions all the time. So their way around that is to shift parameters. You know, the whole question of interoperability is crucial here. One of the, it's not so much a research method, but a kind of research hunch that we've followed in doing field work around these kinds of processes in different parts of the world, is to look for the, it's hard to call it a place, more the kind of situation where interoperability breaks down. Because the hunch is that when you find that situation, that's where culture and society rushes in. You see all the kind of cultural translations taking place, you see the social equalities emerging. But the job of the logistician is to close this gap.
Or to profit from it. So there are little spaces you can do from, say, waste, for example, where you can actually open the space up for somebody to step into and solve a problem momentarily at least.
Yeah, sure. And I guess that's one of the issues we want to look at with Gay in these future extractivism seminars. In terms of the circular economy that Stephen and others are working on, is there an extractivist moment in recycling in terms of the pulling of value from waste? So yes, there are ways in which parameters shift on the ground, and I guess you can see these parameters in terms of end times. You know, this idea that Josh has been discussing, that you know, we're already past the tipping point and we realize it kind of après coup, and then we have to find ways to live in the wake, I think is a very real scenario. It's, you know, it's also a little bit like what the pandemic is now. It's gone away, but it hasn't gone away, but clearly it's going to be around for a very long time. And I think clearly the world is going to be around for a very long time too, despite these, you know, these kind of momentous shifts. So it's, you know, I think it's a real danger to get all eschatological around these scenarios, and we have to find ways to keep going. But the work of shifting parameters, well, it can be negative or positive, to return to some of the terms that we've been throwing around.
We might get back to that one.
I don't really have a response per se to that.
Okay. There are a lot of other things that, one of the things which Abby raised was participatory research, and Isaac raised as well. So this question of engaging with, and you were talking about engaging with the community of supply chain analysis and those sort of things. So that can take different forms. That participatory research, how do you find yourself in that participatory research and having to both be a researcher and an intimate insider, if you like, on the inside of the processes which you're trying to describe? Louise.
Bad week to be asking me that question. We've had a research partner go rogue, but goodness. Let's think about that one. I think I think that's where a lot of the more reflective things that I say increasingly when I talk come from. It's this idea of what on earth are we doing? And I'm really glad you had the stuff to find no quote up there, Abby, because I think that, and as we increasingly want to sort of acknowledge that knowledge and expertise is decentralised, but there is also a role for expertise in context and how we work in that space, and that sort of checking of yourself and your positionality and all the things we know from post-structuralism and you know, how to do curated work, and talking to the people that you're working with and working out, okay, in this team, who's who, you know, who's going to play what role, and swapping hats as well a lot of the time, and it changes between projects, it changes within projects from meeting to meeting and event to event. It's and having that capacity in the teams, both within the university and with the external partners, even though that's kind of an increasingly daft parameter as well. To be able to talk about that and to be able to talk about who's doing what, who's got what expertise, what's relevant to know when. I once had a research assistant who identified himself as my mansplainer. So he would actually go into meetings when we needed a bloke. And he sort of described himself in this wonderful way, so I won't say it to be recorded, but as being essentially defined by his genitalia in such a way that people would understand him because they had the same bits. And like, yes, do that. We need that in this meeting, so go big bloke me so that they'll hear me. And it's just being really open about those capacities and legibilities as well. And who needs to be deployed when, and what knowledges and what skills, and the cultural deficits that were being talked about before, and how you may or may not address those according to who's in the room, and the languages that we use, when we use them, the personalities that we adopt, the clothes that we wear, like all of those things have to be up for discussion, and realising all of them are part of what we're doing. And that there are times when different configurations of those are better or worse for the work that we're trying to do. And that came profoundly from work that's probably the work we've done in Jira, like a decade ago or longer, and watching the way the research needed to be done in that space, and completely not completely, because I've always had a fairly sceptical relationship to academia well-being within it, but really seeing it from the point of view of community, where it was almost a legitimate knowledge system. It was just like, oh, you bunch of whiteys, what do you know? Yeah. But working out how to actually deconstruct and reconstruct appropriate knowledge configurations and skills to achieve the work that needs to be done. Which means you've got to sit down and work out what work is that needs to be done and who's the we and all of those sorts of attendant questions as well. But I feel like I've gone right off track and should probably hand over to Stephen.
I don't know if there's a lot of time for a response, but
just briefly.
all right. I am thinking of the project that we finished a few years back on manufacturing futures. Where we interviewed 88 people from 12 different enterprises, worker co-ops, family firms, capitalist manufacturers, and social enterprises, and we asked them about their daily operations, like how do they hire people, how do things work, and we listened really carefully, and what we heard from that was actually they really do value their employees because, in a sense, holding on to a skilled labor force in a country like this one where mining is always an alternative to manufacturing, they really do invest in their people, and they really do care about environmental sustainability as a practical consideration because that's now part of the social license to operate. But the beauty of that project was when we got them all together in the same room, they began to recognize that same capacity for articulating a just and sustainable future for manufacturing in having their words reflected back to them. So there was a dialogic process in which a new subjectivity emerged. And we had the public launch on January of 2020, and it felt like we were going to really head somewhere with this project, and something else happened. But now it feels really timely to think about, oh gee, actually maybe kind of a mistake to hollow out the second sector. And maybe we need all of those skills, just for the sake of those improvisations and hospicing processes that I just described. That could play a crucial role in, leveraging certain opportunities. Like, I'm waiting for the Aussie dollar to float back up because we have control over all these critical minerals. Instead, we seem to get the short end of the stick in everybody's supply chain.
Well, we're in the belly of the beast, so any questions, any comments, any responses? We have time for two.
This very direct one for Brett. Your mode of presentation was radically different from other presentations you've given. It was much more kind of animated and kind of in your face. I just wondered, is this a new Brett we're seeing here? A more aggressive, attacking kind of Brett?
Wow.
I don't know, I wasn't reading out the papers, so maybe it's just... I said I wasn't reading out the papers, so maybe it's just improvisation, which is something that Stephen's been talking about.
I like it.
I can do that, yeah. I guess it relates to who was asking the question of the panel this morning of moving through different contexts and different kinds of persona and being fake and authentic. So I wouldn't say it's a new authentic Brett. All the Bretts are fake. And the only authenticity emerges through, having to hold yourself accountable to another audience in what you would say to one. But never say anything to an audience that you wouldn't say to another.
Yes, I agree with that. Amanda?
Yes, thanks, gang. They were really thought-provoking presentations, and I really sympathise, I think, with these ideas of storytelling and conviviality and listening and so on. But it also makes me think that when you put your emphasis there, what you de-emphasise, if you like, is the dissent, the moments of conflict, the sticky moments, if you like. So I'm just wondering what you would say is the place of conflict in the way that you're thinking about the processes in their various guises. Does that make sense?
Well, I just briefly say that in the kind of research scenarios I've been, I think there's always conflict. Particularly in international scenarios where you're, moving agendas and money across different spaces. When you fly in and fly out, this creates conflict. But it's also about collaboration. They don't come without each other, and the conflict can be productive without being dialectical.
I guess in the briefest possible terms, I can't think of a bigger conflict. It's not just ideological between hubris and humility in terms of the type of magnitude of the decisions that are made. Everything I said was factually accurate, except for the fictitious blowing up the Isthmus of Panama. In terms of making the Pacific and oceans merge, dissipate the heat, there's not any speculative scenario. But there's a lot of violence in all the scenarios, and I think the analogy with war is a good one. There aren't any ways about this that aren't going to involve, So the hubris and humility. There's you mentioned disagreeing with yourself. Wow, it's obviously huge tensions between people, within people, between communities, between nation states, etc.
Yeah, and I think it's a really timely question as well, because again, if I think about sort of role of storytelling in the Lithgow work. It's not about trying to find a singular story, because I think there's probably been a bit of a top-down singular story historically, and so I think part of what will be happening, there's a media lab getting set up there, and so part of the work will be training up people to create their own content, and that's going to mean everyone's got a different story. But I think just opening up that space to actually start that dialogue. And we've sort of had instances of problematic behaviour, I guess, where it's been sort of disruption for the sake of it. And it's been interesting watching the response amongst everyone in terms of, well, no, that's actually really not helpful. We can disagree, but if you're just going to come in here and blow up things for the hell of it, then you're not really interested. So it's how to start, how the space actually evolves and emerges as set by the parameters of the people who are there in terms of, well, how do we want to, talk about things that are quite vexatious and which do have quite varied and at times very contrasting and conflicting positions. And part of the opening up of the space is to actually say, well, what does that stuff look like? And what are there ways in which the creative industries can help explore that terrain? Rather than sort of, I'm going to create a happy story and that's going to be awesome. It's like, well, how do we actually use those modalities to explore these very real conflicts on the ground between, well, the lines appear to be closing and that's a thing, and no, climate change isn't real, and all of these things are really live and actually on the ground. So it's work in progress, really.
Yeah, I don't think we need to have agreement or tell the same story in order to make whatever, I want to call it progress, but not really. It's more like, again, this hospicing process that we can facilitate with engagement. So for example, that biodigester in the abattoir, the fellow who ran the abattoir was a climate skeptic and was never going to agree on those grounds. But Martin Engineering from the United States made a commercial proposition which said, you give us the land, we'll put in $2 million of capital, this will pay for itself in 4 years because we're going to sell you 355 kilowatts of power per day at a fair market price. And the abattoir is willing to play ball because they are able to stay below the tariff pricing structure. And that's what's going to keep them in business because their power bill is $1 million a year, right? And again, that's the largest employer in the town. So, in a way, like, we can move between different stories and motivations and still accomplish things. And I guess that's sort of the context of engagement I'm interested in exploring, and why it is that, we can talk about just sustainability without having a clear idea of what that might mean, but enough of an idea that we can begin to inject it into a language and a different kind of politics. Yeah. And a different version of circularity, too, because we desperately need one.
Thank you. Thank you for your participation today, but also the last however many years you've been involved with the Institute. It's been a fantastic time. The last day and a half has been quite uplifting and heartening. I'm one of those eschatological persons who believe the end of the world is nigh and I'm researching accordingly. But it's great to hear that some of you believe there's a future. Please thank our panellists. So we have time now for a few together through a very difficult period. Heather Lawson.
I'm forever known as the pandemic director. That's my subtitle. I want to keep my words sort of brief at the end of this because Juan Salazar, DJ Salazar, is waiting, so I don't want to get in trouble. But I did want to just say a few thank yous. First, all the panelists have been really great. Just really great presentations, really thoughtful. Taking us through the sort of beginning and the futures of ICS, CCR, all of that were there. So I really, we're grateful that you sort of realized what we had imagined as a kind of conference committee in your great presentation. So I wanted to thank all of you. I also wanted to thank Mandy Thomas, who I think you might be the last member of the first panel standing here today, but to really thank Mandy for coming, joining us, staying through the end. It was really wonderful to really be able to kind of commemorate the kind of beginning of what this is now. I mean, we always, when we wanted to set up this event, we knew we had to kind of stick within the frame of the 10th anniversary celebrations, but we always wanted to kind of, celebrate and pay homage to, all the work that's been going since Ian arrived at Western Sydney, the intercultural studies, there was another one, the Centre for Cultural Research, and then this. So it was really wonderful to have you here to really bring that really to the fore in really, really wonderful ways. So thank you, Mandy, in particular. You didn't really get to thank you. I also wanted to thank our Master of Ceremonies and Poet Florian, as Catherine Gibson calls him, David Rowe, for doing an incredible job shepherding. That yesterday changed at every turn. It was exactly not like what we had in the program, but we did know that some things would shift. But it was really brilliant to have you there to really shepherd us into that first day. It was a really great thing. I think we had originally 92 RSVPs, and I think over 82 people came. So that's a pretty impressive. We expect a big drop off normally for all of these things. So that's really impressive, and I think there were so many people here. Former professional staff, all sorts of people, who were there. So it was really great to actually just have that moment collectively to celebrate and have some affirmations from the VC and Deborah Sweeney, et cetera, along the way. So that was really great. I also, the chairs have also been really great. I think Ned, Hart, Juan sort of got pulled into this. Everyone else was a member of the kind of anniversary committee, but it was really great. It actually is very challenging to corral 4 or 5 different voices because we were desperate to try to get as many perspectives. We can't get everyone. We know we missed, huge areas of really important research at the ICS, but we wanted to try to get as many people as possible, and that is no easy feat. So really grateful to all the panel chairs for really kind of pulling things together. And finally, I want to thank Sally and Elise. They're both over preparing already, so they won't hear, but they've been amazing. Sally, this is really Sally's first big event since she got here in 2020 also. And so I think she's really delighted to be able to kind of, bring this together. And she and Elise are a fantastic team. So when you do see them over there, please do just extend a word of thanks to them. I'll try to separate out, but I promise we'll no speeches. So we'll make sure that they know how appreciative we are as, in the coming weeks. But finally, I just want to thank the committee for this event. I think Kay Anderson, she was our very first volunteer almost a year ago. She said, I think I can do that. Kay has been really wonderful, keeping that history very present in all of our discussions, saying, what about this, what about that? And she even inspired me to send probably the sternest email I've ever written at ICS. So sweet, wonderful support of Kay was behind that. So thank you to Kay. Obviously, Ian, none of us would be here without you. You've been brilliant along the way. You've really, just kept us on track and schedule and really been great with making suggestions, including Mandy, who was the very first decision that we made as a committee, that she was the person who we wanted to kind of give the most time and airspace to. So the VC tried to compete, but you were Paul, you've been brilliant. You really, this has been a great panel, I have to say, and you've just been, I'll do whatever you want, the whole way, and you really have been very helpful as we've gone through. David Rowe, obviously, the first up for Master of Ceremonies was you know, keeping track of things from the UK. I think in the middle of, you know, you had COVID for a while. You really kept us, you've been through it, so I'm really grateful here. And then of course Juan Salazar, who is waiting in the next thing, and I promised. And we sort of decided that in the midst of, you know, very difficult times, actually, it often means that there's great music. And so Juan has been he's been working away on his playlist, and we'll also hear from Waldo Garrido, who's one of our ICS members, and we're going to do that. I know people are mindful of time and things like that. We're going to try to do that in the first half hour when we get over there, but please, just thank you everyone, and please do come and enjoy the less formal, no performative, anything needs to happen, just enjoy yourselves. So thank you very much. I just wanted to mention that Gerard Goggin is here, and he is our new advisory board chair. He wasn't able to join us he's just flown in from Singapore, so really grateful to have you here as well.